morning. Welcome to the Committee on Budget and Fiscal Review. Today we have an informational hearing so that we can look at California's child care and early learning system. We do have session at noon today, so we're going to proceed expeditiously, and I suspect that we'll have good amount of time for public comment as well after the presentation. So we're going to begin with the Legislative Analyst's Office, and we invite Virginia Early to join us. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members. Virginia Early, Legislative Analyst's Office. So today, I'm going to be providing you with an overview of California's child care and preschool programs, provide some information on recent augmentations, and provide an assessment of the current system. After Department of Finance discusses the governor's budget proposal, I'll come back and we'll share our analysis and recommendations of those specific proposals. The sergeant should be passing out a handout, and so I'm going to walk you through this handout. So on page 1 of the handout, we discuss California. We provide a brief description of California's child care and preschool programs. As you can see from the chart, we categorize these programs in 3 different ways. We have child care for CalWORKs participants, child care for non-CalWORKs participants, and several preschool programs. As you can see, the chart provides additional details on these individual programs and the estimated number of slots for each of those programs in 2015-16. Moving to page 2 of the handout, we provide a brief overview of some key components. So all the programs that are listed on page 1 of that handout have eligibility criteria. However, those eligibility criteria vary between the programs. Family income is one of those criteria. So for the CalWORKs programs and most non-CalWORKs child care programs, all families participating must have incomes below 70% of state median income. That's about $42,000 for a family of 3. However, transitional kindergarten does not have income eligibility requirements. Programs also vary based on the age of the child. Most child care programs serve children birth through age 12. However, state preschool serves 3- and 4-year-olds, and transitional kindergarten serves children who turn 5 between September 2nd and December 2nd. Most child care programs also require parents to be working in school or receiving training during the time that they receive care. However, part-day state preschool and transitional kindergarten do not have work requirements for the parents. Care is provided in a variety of settings: centers, which tend to be larger classroom-like settings, family child care homes where the care is provided in an individual's home and about 6 to 12 children are served, and license-exempt providers who are a family, friends, and neighbor that the state pays a lower rate to care for individual children. CalWORKs programs and the alternative payment program can utilize all 3 types of these settings. However, other child care programs can only access centers and family child care homes. The standards also vary between the programs. All programs have to meet basic health and safety standards and meet certain staffing qualifications, which may vary slightly between the programs. However, some programs, including state preschool and general child care, also require the care to include developmentally appropriate activities. So for instance, for state preschool, these developmentally appropriate activities, children may include basic numeracy and literacy type activities. Page 4 of the handout discusses the state's funding model for the various programs. Typically, we fund the programs based on vouchers, direct contracts, and school district allocations. For instance, CalWORKs is provided through vouchers, where families can choose a provider that meets their needs, and then the state will reimburse that provider for the cost of care. Voucher rates vary across the state, and so some rates in some areas are higher than rates in other places. However, state preschool, general child care, some of those other types of programs, the state contracts with individual centers or family child care homes to provide the care. And for those contracted types of care, the state provides a standard reimbursement rate that is the same across the state and does not vary based on the market. The state also funds transitional kindergarten based on average daily attendance of all eligible children and the school district allocations. Page 4 discusses some recent augmentations to the system in 2014 and 15 and 2015-16. Specifically, about $247 million was allocated for additional slots in those 2 years. $243 million was allocated for rate increases. $136 million was allocated for increases in higher caseload and average cost of care for CalWORKs, and about $100 million was allocated for various quality improvement activities across those 2 years. Page 5 discusses our assessment of the current system. So the system is very complicated, and we're trying to cover it at a high level here. If you have further questions, we'd be happy to dive more here. But at a high level, the state provides some families choice in selecting childcare that meets their needs. These families receive vouchers. They can choose a provider that's convenient for them. However, other families have to access childcare preschool at whichever center has an open slot, and they don't have as much ability to select a convenient provider. Most of the programs are prioritized to low-income children. However, the transitional kindergarten program does not prioritize resources to children based on income. Moreover, similar families across the state have different levels of access both to subsidized childcare and preschool, because the slots for subsidized childcare and preschool are not distributed evenly across the state, and different counties serve different percentages of their eligible children. In terms of standards, some programs are required to include developmentally appropriate activities, whereas other programs are not required to include those activities. And so you could have similar families receiving very different levels of care. In addition to that, the state pays more for a lower standard of care, because in many cases, the regional market rates for vouchers is higher on average than the standard reimbursement rate for contracts. However, vouchers need to meet lower developmental standards than the contracted facility. So in many cases, the state may be paying more for a lower standard of care. Finally, while some childcare is reimbursed based on these regional market rates, the regional market rates are not tied to the current market prices for childcare. And so families in different counties, depending on how the rates have changed historically, may not have the same level of access as families in other counties. That concludes my overview. I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
I suspect we could spend a couple hours asking questions. I'm going to begin with a few, and I'm sure my colleagues have some as well. Starting on page 1, you do have a column of estimated number of slots. I don't suspect anyone would argue that those estimated number of slots meets the current need. Do we have a number on what the unmet need is? We call that a waiting list.
So the state does not currently track the demand for childcare. The state in the past has had a centralized eligibility list from, I believe, 2005 to 2010, which tracked demand for subsidized childcare across the state. So we don't currently have that, so we can only make rough estimates. So we estimate, for example, for the birth to 5 population, there may be 600 to 700,000 children who would need care, but that's a very rough estimate based on the number of children eligible for free and reduced price lunch and a percentage that we think might be working.
A very significant unmet need.
So Jennifer Kuhn, Legislative Analyst's Office, just another perspective on the question. We do have demographic data on children in California and their family income levels. We don't know if their families are working. That's the component that's missing from the census data in terms of triangulating. But we have found that almost every county is serving less than 20% of their eligible population. Assuming those low-income families, it's sort of a crude estimate, it's assuming all those low-income families are working and would be eligible eligible for service. But even if you were to make a different assumption, that 20% is rather low. Maybe it goes up to 40% at the extreme.
But more accurately, working or looking for work, or maybe even in school.
Yes, I'm sorry, yes.
Right. So if not 20%, it's still, are we meeting 50% of the demand out there?
We don't have a good way of knowing what the demand is because we don't have this centralized eligibility list anymore.
And please remind us how it is that we don't track that any longer.
So I believe it was one of the decisions made during the recession. We used to spend, I believe it was about $8 million annually on this list. Counties each had a list where families would go to put themselves on a waiting list for childcare, and then they would automatically be on all the waiting lists in the county. And then that information was aggregated at the state level so that policymakers would have an understanding of the demand. But so it served two functions: one, convenience for families, and two, providing information to the state.
Given that we're holding this hearing today because the administration has a bold new proposal in the works, would you suggest that having a clear picture of what the demand is and what the unmet need is of that demand would be a good thing to have as we rejigger an entire very complex system?
Yes, we've recommended reinstating the centralized eligibility list.
Can you put a price tag on what that would be? You had mentioned $8 million. Would it be just that?
Yeah, somewhere between 5 and 10 million. We'd probably have to work with you to get more exact estimates.
So a very relative minimal cost, we could put back in place a piece that is really critical to our better understanding what we should be designing as we begin to redesign.
Yes.
Well, we think getting a better handle on demand is very important in terms of understanding the eligible population. But as Virginia walked through, the underlying structures that California has today, we would argue, even if we don't have great information on demand, the legislature could get started in improving that structure. Once the state were to have better data on demand, it would make it all that much easier to try to equalize slots across counties, for example.
How long would it take once the investment is made to get the information that we're talking about?
It depends on how the list is developed, but my guess would be CDE would probably have a better sense of what that kind of system would look like and how soon data would be available.
But there may be a lag time of a year or two?
Potentially.
Yeah. On page 4, you clearly lay out our recent reinvestments after the cuts of the recession. Can you remind us in each of these categories how much we did cut so we can see what percentage of that cut we have reinvested?
So let me see if I have that information with me. Can I work with your staff to get back to you?
Sure, sure.
You answered one of my, or you asked one of my questions.
Okay, and then on page 5, as you had pointed out, for various reasons, the state might be paying more for lower standards of care, which of course sounds very counterintuitive. How would you propose addressing that curiosity?
So we've recommended, and we'll talk more about this later when we get into the governor's proposal, but we've recommended transitioning into a voucher system and moving everyone onto a regional reimbursement rate. So rates would be equalized across the state, and then addressing the lower standard of care by requiring all voucher providers to include developmental components for children birth through 3.
If we were to follow that suggestion, would there be need for additional investment?
The state could do it either way. If the state wanted to keep the rates the same as they currently are, the state would require between, I believe, 20 to about 70 million additional augmentation. The state could also adjust the regional market rates to make the difference.
There's actually, it's a quite difficult question to answer because of the structures the state has in place today. So if the state is paying these Title V direct contract centers that have the developmentally appropriate requirements less today than this other, then it raises this question, well, how much does it cost to provide that level of care? But we have, even though the regional market rate, the voucher rates, the Title 22 rates on average are higher today, and so Virginia is indicating it would cost some money to get to those higher rates. But then I think also embedded in your question is, well, what if we're asking more of those providers? Is there an additional amount we would need to provide? And that's sort of up for debate. You could provide some one-time money to get existing providers better qualified if you were to raise the requirements you're placing on them. But it's not entirely clear from the evidence you would have to pay a higher rate for that. You could just, in the adjustment, keep with the rate structure you have on the voucher side. It could be enough to do what you're asking them to do.
Okay, thank you. We'll start with Senator Nielsen and then just go down the line. Senator Roth, Senator Allen, Senator Bonnie, and I know Senator Pan had a question as well.
Will you be commenting on your thoughts about the governor's proposal with the block granting, combining in this
Yes.
hearing? Okay.
Yes, after the Department of Finance.
How does California compare to other states in terms of our child care support levels?
So California is pretty generous compared to other states. So specifically, California has one of the highest income eligibility thresholds in the nation. We're higher than about 40 other states in terms of the incomes we let families come into the program with, and higher than about 30, 35 other states in terms of the income cutoff to exit the program. We don't require minimum work hours of the parents participating in the program, and we don't have a maximum number of hours that families can receive care for. And so we tend to be pretty generous. Also, many states lose eligibility for their welfare to work population once they exit cash aid. We provide ongoing child care to all families who have been on cash aid until they either income out of the program or age out of the program.
And there is some discussion of moving the child care into the Prop 98. Is it timely to try to do that right now?
And so as some of you might recall, childcare has been in and out of 98, and different slices of it over time have been in, out, and in. And we as an office haven't made pronouncements on the right place for putting it. Our general concern has just been that you have policy rationale for doing it and that you treat the programs consistently over time.
There's some concern that the schools have not met their local control funding formula levels yet, and they're going to have a spiking in terms of the pension contributions coming up. It may be premature to consider this now. That's just a thought.
And this year, under the governor's proposals and our assessment of this proposal, he has no major shifting in and out.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Nielsen. Before we go to Senator Roth, on one of Senator Nielsen's questions with regard to how we compare, and you said we're higher than maybe 40 some other states, that would not probably adjust for our higher cost of living.
No, it doesn't.
And if we were to adjust, do we have any idea?
We don't, but we can work with your staff to get you that
Okay,
information.
thank you. Senator Roth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm concerned about historical allocation inequity, and I noticed that's referenced in your report once we get to the governor's budget proposal, so I'll hold off and see what you say about that then. But with respect to the comment on page 5 about families across the state having different levels of access, why have the slots been allocated differently across the state? Is it due to the recession and the lack of an eligibility list, or did it predate that time?
So the Department of Education would probably have a more nuanced answer to your question. My understanding is that in many cases, it's based on historical factors.
So a historical formula that may in fact not be accurate today.
I would recommend asking the Department of
Okay, well, thank you.
There are also sort of complicated interactions between the eligible population and the market. So for example, on the contract side, we have CDE allots contracts to counties, particular providers, a certain number of slots. If they can't be met, then they reallocate those to centers who do have capacity. So some of it's being driven by the capacity and the willingness, desire of providers to open around the state. And that can be driven by factors that aren't necessarily just I have an eligible population to serve. They can be driven by I've got private pay clients in the area, and I've also got some subsidized clients I can make ends meet. As much of childcare is sort of more complicated answer, it hasn't entirely been driven by state policy to have these inequities. It's just the way the state has done business has allowed them to materialize.
But we certainly have to then design our policies to encourage providers to have capacity, to encourage the appropriate allocation of funds so that we equally serve the population of the state of California, whether it's coastal, urban, inland, or wherever.
Yes, the state would have to consider the capacity, the rules, how it defines eligibility, how it makes payments. These things would be intertwined to actually do the equalization were the state to decide it wanted to head in that direction.
Hopefully you'll cover that in the budget proposal brief. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Roth. Senator Morlock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe to follow up on that question, do you have a map of the state that shows where the child care activities are occurring? And like, a little darker if it's heavier use or lighter, where it's not utilized at all?
For our 2004 report, we made a few maps to try to share with you, but it became a little uncomfortable because the underlying data, because we don't have this perfect match between low income and working families, we decided not to include. So the best we have is that about 20% of the eligible population, less than that across counties, is being served. We do know more eligible children are served in San Francisco than in Tulare, the Bay Area, than the Central Valley, but we weren't quite confident we could have gradations that were so fine that they would give you much more than that.
But you would see the concentration, it would be in the Bay Area and in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, I would presume.
Yes, but I'm sorry, I'm not sure about the LA area. Higher.
We believe so, but we can get you some more detailed information about that.
But you measure this stuff, right? So we know who's being served and where we're spending our money.
Yeah, we know the number of, we know the number of slots in each county. I don't have that information in front of me right now. The issue is when you start comparing the number of slots to the people that you think you might be eligible for those slots, it becomes a little bit more complicated because of some of the data issues we have.
But do you do any cost-benefit relationships? Are we more successful in San Francisco than Tulare County, or are we spending more elsewhere? Do we do a per capita at all?
So there are a variety of things that are happening. I think were you to look just at state funding, you would still see differences across counties because of these things we were mentioning a moment ago where contracted slots or voucher slots, how they were distributed by the state over the course of decades. You'll also find differences in how counties pull together federal funding, First Five funding, private funding, and so those will also, in some cases, magnify the differences across counties. So, for example, the Bay Area is making a concerted effort to combine First Five with some federal money they received with state money. And that's happening to some extent in other places. I'm sort of guessing, but I think LA, I know, is doing some of that. I don't think to the same extent. And then you'll have rural areas who are probably doing it far less.
Do we ever get audited? Does the state auditor come in? How often? Every other year? Every third year?
To audit what specifically?
Just your whole program. How often is it audited?
I don't know.
Well, so there's much compliance in child care. So the federal government's looking very carefully at how Head Start providers are delivering service. The state's looking very carefully at how state preschool is being delivered and has its own compliance monitoring system that checks at their books. And the voucher program has AP agencies and the state and community care licensing that are checking both that they're meeting standards and their books. I think what we're getting at is is because the data is just not so great, and we were talking about the cells a little bit earlier with the waiting lists, unfortunately, we don't know as much about the service population and any duplication in programs in terms of a child being served through multiple. That's what's making it difficult to know exactly the share of the eligible population served across the state.
But you're monitoring the quality control, so everyone in the state is getting the same level of service.
Well, so by design, no. By design, California is saying we'll have these Title V centers and we'll send out CDE and we'll do compliance monitoring and make sure they're meeting developmentally appropriate standards. We just won't do that for a whole series of other centers. We'll send out community care licensing. They'll ensure health and safety, not necessarily they won't be checking developmental components. So by design, California is allowing very similar children to get access to different care at different rates with different standards with potentially different providers.
But we're monitoring it. So we're making sure that everyone's getting treated.
We're making sure everyone has basic health and safety. I think what Jen is speaking to is we're not making sure all the programs are including developmental components.
Okay, so when will you?
Well, under our recommendations that we'll get to in a bit, we do recommend that the state require all providers to include developmental components to the care for all children birth through 3, and we have some suggestions of how the state could monitor that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Morlock. And Ms. Kuna, on your comment in response to Senator Morlock's question about per capita equity, some counties are dipping into their own general funds to augment state investment and federal investments, right? So some counties, I think in the Bay Area, may have greater per capita spending or even per youth spending, per child spending.
Yeah, since our understanding across counties, there are differences in the way they're intermingling funds to offer their programs.
Right. Colleagues, any other questions for the LAO before we ask the Department of Finance to come up? All right. I think you're going to hang around?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, because we're going to have a response from you after Ms. Holmes presents from the Department of Finance. Welcome, Ms. Holmes.